Howdy. I've some final things to revisit before I move on from the warrior type skills, but the video script was getting big, so I've decided to split it into 3 parts. There is the opinion that increasing the complexity too much isn't suitable for this particular game. Plus, there is always the chance that many of these ideas may sound good in theory, but don't work out or interact well with each other in practice. There is also the camp that says Elder Scrolls was supposed to be an intricate role-playing game, and that Bethesda's current trajectory of dumbing things down is damaging their recent releases. I think both of these have some validity to them, and there is a solution that could help to satisfy each side. Difficulty options. Now, the current Bethesda difficulty slider is kind of a heap of steaming dog shit. It drastically increases the damage the player takes, and also reduces the damage NPCs take from the player. And that's it. Sure, this should be an element of game difficulty, maybe even the main element, but it doesn't have to be the only one. And maybe not to this extent. Increasing enemy health makes fights last longer, increasing the opportunity the player has to make mistakes or to get hit, which in turn whittles down resources more. Boosting this too high turns the combat into a damage-spongy slogfest. Increasing damage taken puts more pressure on the player to avoid it, reduce it, or recover from it. But boosting this too high can invalidate some playstyles, causing people to converge on fewer, more optimal ways of playing, rather than just having fun. And reducing these too much makes the combat boring. There's also an issue with having a flat percentage boost across the board. Yes, it's easy to implement, but, even if done well, can have the problem of easy enemies not being affected enough and still being easy as a result, whereas the same percentage boost applied to an already difficult enemy can make them straight up unfair. A more bespoke approach could give each enemy type their own scaling, with weaker enemies receiving a much bigger boost to bring them up to snuff, and already tough enemies not being that much different to normal. I like to think of difficulty options as a tool to customize the game. The easier difficulty options could be for those who just want the simpler fantasy experience without getting bogged down with lots of mechanics. They could just ignore half of the game and still get the surface level enjoyment out of it. The harder difficulties can be for the more dedicated masochists, who want to be forced to use every tool they have available in order to survive. And the normal difficulty can be balanced somewhere in between, requiring some effort to be put in, but not making you worry too much. Some different ways difficulty could be adjusted include making enemies more aggressive and use power attacks more frequently, so the player has to watch out for them and defend more often, and maybe think about different ways of defending. Inversely, making enemies use their defensive options more frequently organically increases their survivability in a way that doesn't just let them tank more hits while hitting you back. Increasing the detection speed and radius of enemies would make the stealth also be impacted by difficulty. Decreasing the rate at which off-screen enemies attack the player at lower difficulties would mean they don't have to be as aware of their surroundings. Having enemies spawn with and use potions and other buffs more often could make it seem like the AI is smarter and more proactive than it actually is. This would also give the player more supplies to loot on higher difficulties, which they would have a greater need for. In a similar vein, debuffs such as diseases and poison usage could also be made more likely. One of the issues I take with effects like poison and bleed, not just in Skyrim but also in Souls games, is that they are applied even when they are successfully blocked. I know they say to think of your weapon as an extension of yourself, but this is ridiculous. This could be changed by default or merged with the Deflect Arrows perk to make that more worth it, and to make shields better at defense outside of just reducing the damage number. Some of these options could also be applied to individuals, creating different NPC personality types, meaning slightly different enemy and ally behaviours to react to. Have some more thoughts related to attribute requirements. There is already a level restriction for equipment tiers randomly spawning into the game world, which does take care of most of the balancing, though some things do slip between the cracks. So adding requirements in addition to leveled loot is unnecessary and maybe goes too far, but let's run with it for a moment. Enemy and loot spawns do depend on the player level. And, as it turns out, Skyrim also has minimum dungeon levels. So if loot were to be tied to these as well, that would create a risk-reward system, giving the player a chance at finding a piece of higher tier loot early if they manage to clear a dungeon that is above their level. There could also be the chance for some pieces of higher level gear to be sold in shops, with item value naturally gatekeeping the player's ability to buy better gear. This way, better items are already out there in the world from the get-go, with a seemingly more organic rarity, instead of it just suddenly appearing based on some metaphysical threshold. This change shifts things away from the world revolving around the player and closer towards the player just being another inhabitant of the world. Having all gear that spawns into the game be at the player's level or lower means that most of it is going to be junk. Adding that opportunity to find a piece of higher level gear that might be useful to your character gives an extra chance for that newly found piece to actually be useful and replace previous gear, especially with up to 12 armor slots to fill plus weapons. Attribute requirements would then serve the role of giving a stat check to make sure your character can actually use them. Another argument for attribute requirements is items that are unique or semi-unique. Some unique items are scaled according to the player's level at which they were found, to try and make sure they're not overpowered for the current enemy level. This often doesn't matter because they're not actually unique, but rather just a generic weapon with an enchantment you can find elsewhere. The downside is that when there truly is a unique item, this leveling means that you can accidentally find it too early, and hence it will be permanently hamstrung for the rest of that save file. Attribute requirements can serve a role here. First, do away with unique item leveling. Decide on an enchantment strength and a material tier for each one. For some this is easy. The Axe of Whiterun, for example, will most likely be acquired pretty early on, and it is a weapon given to the Thane of that town, so the Nordic design of steel makes for a good fit. Or, for added significance, how about Skyforge steel, being slightly better and more viable to use for longer, making it stand out as a unique weapon, and tying it to the specific lore of the location in which you got it. Being an exception to the rule that only companions can use Skyforge steel would even add some intrigue as to who owned it originally. Also, they should do the bare minimum of just changing the colour of Skyforge steel, so it's not completely identical to regular steel. Other weapons may need more thought, taking into account how out of the way they are, and how much effort is needed to be put in to get them. Even then, depending on the player's journey, they can still vary anywhere from underwhelming, a thing that already happens, to being really powerful. This is where attributes come into play, allowing unique weapons to exist at set values, but again, filtering out unsuitable characters. They could also provide an alternative to minimum quest levels, from which you gain unique items. The quests could still have a recommended level in the quest log, but you would have more freedom to pursue them at any time. The catch being that you may not be able to use the reward just yet. Speaking of which, what's the deal with unsolicited quests thrusting themselves onto you?
A new hand touches the beacon.
This may be good for making sure first-time players get to see all of the game's content, but on repeat playthroughs, or targeted playthroughs, these are just an annoyance that interrupt the player and clog up their quest log with more busy work. Sure, NPCs can grab the player's attention, but let the player choose to approach them. There's also the issue of quest progression. Quests have stages, a chain of them, one leading on to the next. Usually a linear path of scripted things that the player must do to continue, specifically in that order. This can sometimes introduce bugs that prevent quest progression, despite the player having done what is needed. Instead, there could be a more lenient system that is less reliant on quest triggers. Say, rather than the game looking for a specific item entering the inventory at a certain time, and then that quest stage unlocking the dialogue to hand it in, that NPC's dialogue option should just become available, and then allow progression down the quest path if the player has the right item in their inventory, without relying on the quest system when it's not necessary to. When applicable, the system should more loosely observe quest progress, with necessary dialogue or necessary events being unlocked or triggered more locally by what the player does and where they go, rather than being gate-kept by a more centralized system of mandatory quest stages. Some important quest stages can still be responsible for ensuring major changes in the world state are triggered at the right time, such as after beginning or finishing a quest, or at other key points. Intermediate points can still be included in the quest log as useful information for the player, but don't have to be checked off. This looser quest structure and a slight alteration of the end goal could also be used to open up some quests to be completed in more than one way. I think one person said that the current perk system is good for builds, and that adding attribute scaling and reducing perk damage would make it easier to make a good-at-everything god character. And yeah, that's a valid concern. Maybe I can alleviate it, maybe not. My system would give players more ways to up their damage, but a need for skill scaling should still eventually encourage players to settle on one or two main skills. For the best results in the long run, you need the bigger picture of all of these parts working together, not just one or two. Sure, the enemies in the early game will be easier to deal with than they already are, due to the heightened damage floor, but that can be somewhat counteracted by also giving enemies access to scaling and perks, making the system more integrated into the world. In a way, attribute scaling was already in Elder Scrolls games, it just wasn't called that. Strength alone increased physical damage for weapons across the board, whereas here there would be a choice between strength, agility and speed. In this regard, there may be more build variety than previous games, due to having different attributes for different weapons. I think this could strike a balance between weapon mastery being the strongest, while at the same time still allowing more viability to try out more melee options, for people who like realism, or just want to have more weapon variety on one character. Ideally, the perk trees themselves should offer some incentive to stick to one or two skills, with increasing specialization resulting in the strongest abilities. For example, to an extent, you can already make a sort of do-everything build by investing into 3 skills: smithing, to upgrade weapons and armor; enchanting, to boost damage for individual weapon types, magic costs, and armor protection; and alchemy, for temporary boosts when needed. This gets particularly crazy if you use an enchanting alchemy restoration loop to exploit the game. Did they really put each of these in without considering the consequences? Sure, freedom is nice and all, but at the very least you could put some sort of upper cap on how strong players can make each of these things to maintain some semblance of balance. It's like each time they learn from previous games, they then go on to make a new mistake. I think it's okay if some players want to use creative specialization to make a jack-of-all-trades character like this, because they still have to put the necessary time investment in to get those levels. Attribute requirements would also contribute to players voluntarily speccing into one variety of weapon, just on a different axis to weapon skills. They can generalize, but if done too much or at the wrong time, it might come at a cost. I think my design philosophy can be summed up as trying to maximize player freedoms, within reason, but also giving those freedoms logical trade-offs and consequences. Now, to be clear, if a character does have high attributes across the board, then that would help them to be good at anything. Though that shouldn't really be possible until the end game, when the character is practiced in all of the skills anyway. So how quickly should the player be allowed to grow these stats in the meantime? Well, in previous games you could earn as few as 3, or, with careful planning, as many as 15 attribute points per level up. If you've ever tried this method to get the maximum stats, you may have found that this is a miserable way to play the game. So let's just remove any incentive to do that by giving a fixed number of attribute points per level up. Trying to remain similar to previous games, suppose a starting character has an average of 40 points in each of the 8 attributes, minus an additional 10. If they are given a flat 10 points per level, it would take 49 level ups to distribute the remaining 490 points, reaching the height of their natural potential at a nice round soft level cap of 50, with the player still being able to level up skills and obtain perks after this. Or, for a much slower progression, if they are given 5 points per level, then there would be 98 level ups, with the soft cap being at level 99. Out of fairness, for the few enemies that continue scaling with the player way into the late game, their health and damage growth should also stop or slow down past the level where the player's attributes are expected to have maxed out, and arguably could stop even sooner than that, because those final points would contribute the least towards that character's playstyle. There could also be a hybrid leveling system where the player has the choice of investing into attributes or directly into the derived stats, giving players an alternate way of growing their character past the level cap and not making them invest in attributes they don't want. To finish off, here's an updated general idea of what attributes could do, but I think I'll have to mull it over a bit more and come back to it later. We don't even need skills to have explicit governing attributes, as they used to be called. These can just be made to logically suit certain builds better. Anyway, that's all for now. See you in the next one.